Welcome, listeners. Imagine a life where every day feels like a struggle. Bills pile up, opportunities slip away, and the world outside moves on without you. This is the reality Maria faces, a mother doing everything she can to keep her family afloat. But when an email offers the chance of a lifetime, a subsidized government housing program that promises a fresh start, Maria takes the leap, hopeful that this might be the change they've been waiting for. But as they move into their new home, the perfection of their new life feels off. A quiet unease settles over Maria and her children, Carlos and Rosita. The house is too clean, too quiet, and soon they begin to feel like they're not just living in the house, they're being controlled by it. What happens when the promise of a better life comes with a price? Let's find out. All Your Family Needs by NoSleep Scribe. Maria stood in front of the worn kitchen sink, the quiet hum of the faucet the only sound in the otherwise empty room. The sunlight creeping through the grimy window cast long shadows on the chipped tiles, but it was the starkness of the silence that unsettled her the most. The house felt too small these days, too loud with all the unspoken worries swirling in the air. The weight of bills she could never seem to pay off, the ever-growing pile of overdue notices on the counter, and worst of all, the hollow eyes of her children, as though they could feel it too, the way the world outside was moving forward while she stayed stuck, trying to hold it all together. Carlos, her 15-year-old son, had become quieter in the past few months. The weight of adolescence was already heavy on him, but it was his eyes that told the truth. Tired eyes that no longer saw the world through youthful optimism. Instead, they were clouded by something darker, worry, anxiety, fear of what would come next. And Rosita, sweet, innocent Rosita. At 8, she didn't fully understand the cracks forming in their life, but she felt the tension in the air. She no longer ran through the house with that carefree laughter Maria used to hear all the time. The house, once a home, was beginning to feel more like a waiting room. For what, Maria didn't know. She pressed her hands to the edge of the sink and looked down at the checkbook in front of her. She'd written out the numbers, balancing the books as best she could, but every time she added up the figures, it felt like the math was rigged against her. The rent, the utilities, the food, there was barely enough left for anything else. "Come on, Maria, keep it together," she muttered under her breath, trying to steady the tremble in her hand. The phone on the counter buzzed, and Maria glanced at it, her heart skipping a beat. A notification from her email. Government Housing Program. New applications open. For a moment, she hesitated. She'd heard about the program in passing. A subsidized housing initiative from the government offering affordable living arrangements for families like hers. The deal seemed almost too good to be true. Affordable rent, utilities covered, and a stable home for her children. The catch, as they said, was a simple work-from-home job that would provide a steady income. Half her salary would go towards the rent and utilities, but at least there'd be something to build on. No more juggling bills, no more sleepless nights wondering how she'd stretch each paycheck. Maria let out a breath that she didn't realize she'd been holding. This could be it, a way out, a way to give Carlos and Rosita the stability they needed, something she hadn't been able to provide before, a real chance to breathe. She clicked the email and began filling out the application, her fingers trembling with a mixture of hope and desperation. The program was selective, sure, but what else did she have to lose? The weight of the world, it seemed, had already settled on her shoulders, pressing her into the ground. Okay, this is it, Maria whispered to herself as she clicked the final submit button. This is our chance. As the confirmation page loaded, Maria felt a flicker of relief, a brief moment of light in the ever-encroaching darkness. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment of peace, imagining a life where she no longer had to fight tooth and nail to keep her family afloat. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a deal with something she didn't fully understand. The nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, this new home, this new life, would come with a price. Still, Maria pushed the worry aside. She had to believe in something, or she would lose everything. If this housing project could give her family the future they deserved, she would take it. For Carlos, for Rosita, for herself. With a final glance at the empty room around her, she took a deep breath, trying to ignore the strange sense of unease settling in her chest. The email confirmation blinked back at her, a simple message. Your application has been accepted. And for now, that was enough. The moving truck's engine hummed softly as it pulled into the driveway of their new home. Maria stood at the edge of the sidewalk, a mixture of relief and uncertainty swirling in her chest. The house in front of her was neat, almost too neat. Freshly painted, the lawn trimmed and manicured in a way that felt more like a showpiece than a home. It was everything she had hoped for. Clean, modern, safe. Here we are, Maria murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Carlos and Rosita stood beside her, both looking up at the house with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Rosita's wide eyes sparkled with excitement as she took in the large windows, the front porch with its white railing, the growing flower beds at the base of the house. Her gaze bounced between the house and her mother, her lips parted in awe. Wow, Mom, it's huge, Rosita said, her voice a breath of wonder. Maria smiled, though it felt like the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She nodded, trying to mirror her daughter's enthusiasm. It's everything we've been waiting for. Carlos, on the other hand, didn't seem to share the same excitement. He stood at the edge of the yard, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, looking at the house with a skeptical expression. His eyes flicked back to the van, where a couple of workers were unloading boxes. This is it? Carlos asked, his voice low. It doesn't look like a home. It looks like an advertisement. Maria glanced at him, frustration building beneath the surface. This was supposed to be the answer. She didn't want to hear doubts today, not when they were standing on the threshold of a new life. It's different, Carlos, she said, her voice firmer. This is our new beginning. No more worrying about rent. No more juggling bills. This is a good place. Carlos only shrugged and continued walking toward the front door, his face unreadable. Maria sighed, trying to push the frustration away. She had to keep it together, for her children, for herself. Let's go inside, sweetie, she said to Rosita, whose hand was already grasping hers, eager to explore. Together they walked toward the house. It felt too quiet around them, too still. There were no neighbors outside, no voices or laughter from the other houses. The whole neighborhood seemed eerily empty, as if the world had simply paused for them. Inside, the house was just as pristine. The floors gleamed with a polished shine, and the smell of fresh paint lingered in the air. The walls were a neutral beige, the furniture already placed in the rooms, waiting for them to settle in. It was all too perfect, too prepared. Maria felt a strange flutter in her stomach, a cold prickle of unease. Was this really it? The perfect house with its sterile uniform look? Was it too perfect? "Look at this, Mom!" Rosita ran into the living room, her small voice echoing off the empty walls. She threw herself onto the couch, giggling as she jumped on the cushions. "This place is amazing! It's like a dream!" Maria forced another smile, walking into the room to stand beside her. Her eyes lingered on the windows, the clear glass panes letting in sunlight that seemed to reflect too brightly in the empty space. Carlos wandered into the kitchen, his eyes scanning the modern appliances. The fridge was stocked with the basics, as promised by the program, though it felt more like a show home than a real lived-in space. He touched the counter with his fingers, like he was trying to get a feel for it, before pulling back, a furrow creasing his brow. "This isn't right," Carlos muttered under his breath. Maria heard him, but she didn't respond immediately. "There's something weird about this place." "Carlos," she started, her voice cautious, "let's just settle in, okay? We'll make it our home." But even as the words left her mouth, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. This house felt too perfect, too controlled. It wasn't just the pristine, spotless walls or the lack of any personal touch. There was something about the air, the stillness of the place, that unsettled her. Rosita, oblivious to the shift in the atmosphere, ran through the hallways, exploring every corner of the house. Her laughter echoed, light and carefree. Maria watched her go, and for a moment she wondered if maybe her daughter would find joy here, if she would be able to ignore the things that were gnawing at Maria's mind. She turned to Carlos, who was still standing in the kitchen, staring blankly at the refrigerator. His face was pale, his lips set in a hard line. "I don't like it here," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I don't trust it." Maria walked over to him, feeling the tension in the air. She placed a hand on his shoulder, a soft touch. "Carlos, please. It's different. We're safe here." But Carlos pulled away slightly, a flash of anger passing through his eyes. "Safe? How? We don't know anything about this place. What's the catch, Mom?" The words hung in the air between them, unspoken, but they were the ones Maria had been thinking too. The catch. There was too much they didn't know about the housing program, about the remote jobs they were required to take, about the strings that came attached to the financial support. She had been so desperate for stability that she hadn't asked enough questions, but it was too late to turn back now. "We'll be fine," Maria said, though she wasn't so sure. "We're going to make this work. For you, for Rosita, for us." Carlos didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stared out the window again, his gaze lost in the empty street. Maria took a deep breath, trying to push the creeping feeling down. This was their chance. This was the fresh start they needed. She couldn't afford to let doubt ruin it. But as she stood there in the center of the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something just beyond the walls of the house, something that would soon make itself known. And no matter how perfect the house seemed, Maria had a sudden sinking feeling that their troubles were only just beginning. The house was everything Maria had hoped for. The freshly painted walls, the new carpets beneath her feet, the bright sunlight pouring in through wide windows. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but for the first time in years, Maria felt a sense of peace that had been missing far too long. They were safe here. "Mom, look at this room," Rosita squealed, her voice echoing with the joy that had been absent for so long. She twirled in the middle of the living room, her little hands raised high as if she were dancing. "It's huge. I can play in here all day." Maria smiled warmly as she watched her daughter run in circles, her laughter filling the house. Rosita's excitement was contagious, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Maria allowed herself to feel the same rush of happiness. They were free now, free from the constant worry, the stress of bills piling up, the anxiety of never having enough. This house, this new life, it was the future they had been waiting for. "You like it, huh?" Maria asked, her voice soft with affection. Rosita stopped spinning and nodded vigorously. "I love it, Mom. It's perfect. Can I go outside and play?" Maria hesitated, the question taking her by surprise. She hadn't expected Rosita to want to leave the house so soon. After everything, she had imagined Rosita would be just as content to stay inside for a while, to feel out this new environment. But the way Rosita's face lit up with excitement made Maria pause. Maria turned toward the window, looking out at the small, quiet neighborhood. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows, and the streets were still, too still. There was something about the emptiness outside that unsettled her, but she quickly brushed the feeling aside. This was supposed to be a safe place, a sanctuary for her family. "Well," Maria began, her voice soothing, "we'll have plenty of time to play outside later. For now, let's get settled in here." Rosita's face fell for a split second, disappointment flickering across her features. "But Mom, I want to go play with the other kids. I saw a few kids on the sidewalk earlier. They looked like they were going to the park." Maria knelt down to her daughter's level, gently placing her hands on Rosita's small shoulders. "Sweetheart, the park's not going anywhere. But for now, home is the safest place for us. We need to get settled, get comfortable, and we'll have more fun when we're all together, right?" Rosita hesitated for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. But then she nodded, though her eyes were still wide with longing for the outdoors. "Okay, Mom, I'll stay." Maria's heart softened at the sight. She kissed Rosita on the forehead, the familiar warmth of motherly love flooding her chest. "Good girl." She stood, watching as Rosita shuffled off to explore another room, her little feet padding against the floor. For a moment, Maria felt that everything was in place, just as it should be. In the kitchen, Carlos sat at the table, his eyes staring out the window. He had been quiet ever since they moved in, and his unease was becoming harder for Maria to ignore. He wasn't unhappy per se, but there was a tension in the way he carried himself, a resistance to this new life. "Carlos," Maria said softly, approaching him with a gentle smile. You doing okay? You look like you've got a lot on your mind. Carlos didn't immediately look at her. He stared out the window, his fingers tracing the edge of his drink absent-mindedly. After a few seconds, he sighed, finally meeting his mother's gaze. It's just this place, Carlos started, his voice quieter than usual. It's all too perfect, don't you think? Maria felt a tightening in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. Too perfect? What do you mean? I don't know. Carlos ran a hand through his hair, frustration clear in his posture. Everything's so clean, so new. It feels like a show home, not a real home. And Mom, no one's around. Not a single person has come to say hi, not even the next door neighbors. It's like this whole place is just waiting. Maria's stomach nodded. She had felt it too, but she pushed the sensation aside. She wasn't going to let Carlos's doubts infect her. She couldn't afford that. They needed this house. They needed this fresh start. Carlos, she said, trying to keep the unease from her voice. It's just because everything's new. We're still settling in. We'll meet people. And as for the house, well, it's a new program, right? They made it nice for families like ours. That's a good thing. You've got to give it time. Carlos looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. Finally, he nodded, but Maria could see the hesitation still lingering in his gaze. Yeah, maybe, he muttered. I just don't know. Maria felt a pang of worry, but quickly dismissed it. He was just adjusting, that's all. This house would change everything for the better, and soon. Carlos would see that. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house grew quieter, Maria stood by the window again, watching the empty street. The neighborhood was still, as if holding its breath. The sense of solitude she had been feeling all day returned in full force, but this time it was stronger, more invasive. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator, and even that seemed to echo through the otherwise silent house. Maria shook her head, trying to dismiss the growing unease. They were safe here. This was where they belonged. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard Rosita's voice from the next room, singing softly to herself. Maria smiled, her heart lifting as she listened to the innocent sound of her daughter's voice. This was their chance. She turned away from the window, walking toward the sound of Rosita's song. She would make this home work, no matter what it took. It had been a month since they moved in, and Maria was still living in a state of gratitude. Each morning, as sunlight filtered through the blinds, she couldn't help but marvel at the way the house felt. It was different than anything she'd ever known. Calm, quiet, organized. A place where the air didn't feel thick with worry, where the days didn't blur together under the weight of uncertainty. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maria could breathe. She could make breakfast without wondering if they'd have enough eggs for tomorrow. She could let Rosita run around the house without stressing about overdue bills or an unexpected eviction notice. The weight had lifted. The house was perfect, and she had made sure to keep it that way. Rosita, for her part, was as happy as a child could be in their new space. Her toys were scattered across the living room, her books lined up in neat rows. The days were filled with playtime, with the sound of her voice bouncing off the walls as she ran from room to room. But still, every now and again, she asked the same question. Mom, can we go to the park today? Rosita's voice carried a note of excitement that always tugged at Maria's heart. Maria paused, standing in the kitchen as she wiped her hands on the dish towel. She could see Rosita's eager eyes looking up at her, and for a moment a small pang of guilt twisted in her chest. She'd promised Rosita they'd go out more, promised her that things would be better. But something about leaving the house, it just didn't sit right. No, honey, Maria said softly, setting the towel down. Not today. Rosita's face fell slightly, but Maria gave her a warm smile, trying to reassure her. It's just that it's safer here, you know? The house is the best place for us right now. We can play together here. There's no need to go out. Rosita frowned but nodded, her small shoulders slumping in disappointment. Maria felt a pang of guilt, but quickly pushed it aside. It was for the best. There was something about the world outside that was starting to feel unpredictable, dangerous in ways she couldn't explain. The streets outside, the empty sidewalks, the neighbors who didn't seem to be around. It all started to feel like it was too much. Every time Maria even thought about leaving the house, a tightness gripped her chest, a sense of unease she couldn't quite shake. The house was safe. It was the only place she could protect them. I'll play with you, okay? Maria added, hoping to distract Rosita. How about we build a fort together? We can make it big enough for both of us. Rosita's eyes lit up again, her mood shifting quickly as she ran off to grab her stuffed animals. Maria watched her go, the weight of the decision settling heavily in her stomach. She didn't like seeing the disappointment on her daughter's face, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the outside world was a threat, something dangerous that they needed to avoid. She had no reason to feel this way. Everything was supposed to be better now, right? They were safe here, but the fear, the irrational fear, still crept in, no matter how hard she tried to push it down. It made her feel like she was doing the right thing, keeping them inside, keeping them safe. Later that afternoon, Carlos walked into the living room, the usual distance between them growing wider with each passing day. He was always there, but never fully present, as though his mind were somewhere else, stuck in some loop of his own making. Maria watched him carefully as he moved toward the window, standing still for a moment, staring out at the street. He didn't even acknowledge her when she approached. You okay? Maria asked, her voice softer than usual. Carlos didn't turn around right away. He just stood there, hands stuffed in his hoodie pockets, his eyes scanning the neighborhood. Finally, he exhaled sharply and shook his head. I don't know, he muttered. I don't feel right about everything. Maria's chest tightened. Not again. What do you mean? She asked, her tone more urgent now. Everything's fine. We've got a good life here. We're safe. Carlos spun around, his face a mixture of frustration and confusion. That's the thing, Mom. We're always safe. All we do is stay here. And I get it, we're supposed to be happy. But it's like we're living in a bubble. I don't feel like I'm even part of the world anymore. It's like we're just stuck here. Maria opened her mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. Stuck? Was that how he saw it? Was that how it felt to him? She glanced at Rosita, who was sitting on the floor, lost in her game, and for a brief moment, she wondered if maybe she was doing the right thing. Maybe keeping them here, keeping them safe, wasn't the answer. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the outside world was too dangerous, too full of uncertainty. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Carlos," she began, her voice soft but firm. "We're safe here. This is where we need to be. I know it might feel different, but you'll get used to it. The outside world, it's too much right now. We don't need to go out. Summer break is over in just a couple weeks. Maybe you'll feel better when school starts back." Carlos stared at her for a long time, his eyes searching hers as if trying to find something he wasn't sure was there. Finally, he nodded, though it was clear he didn't really agree with her. "Yeah," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Okay, maybe you're right." That night, as the house settled into its usual quiet, Maria lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling. The thoughts that had been creeping in all day returned with a vengeance. The fear of leaving, the tightness in her chest whenever she thought about stepping beyond the front door. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't imagining it. It was just safer here. It had to be. Maria squeezed her eyes shut, willing the uneasy feeling to dissipate. Tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow they would settle into this life, this safe, secure life, and everything would feel right again. But as she drifted off to sleep, the nagging thoughts stayed with her, swirling in the back of her mind. What if leaving wasn't just unsafe? What if it was something worse? It was one of those afternoons that seemed to stretch on forever, with the sun hanging low in the sky and the streets as empty as they'd always been. Carlos had been pacing around the house, restless, his mind racing. He had spent weeks in this house, trying to get comfortable, trying to adjust, but something wasn't right. His mom, Maria, seemed perfectly content, even happy, but there was this heaviness to the air that Carlos couldn't shake. The house was supposed to be a fresh start, a safe place, but it felt more like a cage. Rosita was inside, lost in her toys, and Maria was busy in the kitchen, humming softly to herself, absorbed in her own world. The house felt peaceful, but there was a tension lurking beneath the surface that Carlos couldn't ignore. He had to know what was going on. He had to find out if it was just him, or if everyone else in the neighborhood felt this way too. Carlos glanced out the window where the streets remained eerily quiet. No cars, no people walking. It was like the neighborhood had been frozen in time, the silence a constant presence. He grabbed his jacket and walked to the door, a mix of hesitation and curiosity clawing at him. The thought of leaving the house made his chest tighten, but it wasn't just the house that kept him here. It was fear, the kind he couldn't quite name, the fear that had started with his mother's reluctance to go outside, the hesitation that settled over her every time they mentioned leaving. It wasn't just her. He could feel it too, a pull. Something was keeping them inside, and the more he thought about it, the more he wondered if it was more than just comfort. Maybe it was something else. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door. The air outside felt cool against his skin, the breeze brushing his face as he stepped onto the front porch. He hesitated for a moment, looking around. He could hear the faint hum of the neighborhood, but not a single person was in sight. Carlos swallowed hard and made his way down the street, each step feeling heavier than the last. He was determined to talk to the neighbors to figure out if they were feeling the same unease he had been carrying for weeks. The first house he approached was just like the others. A neat, well-kept yard, the windows perfectly clean, the lawn trimmed. He knocked on the door, tapping lightly, but the sound felt too loud in the silence. His heart raced in his chest, and he felt a twinge of fear rise up within him. No one answered at first, but just as he was about to turn away, the door creaked open, and an elderly woman stood on the other side, peering out at him through the cracks. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but cautious. Carlos stood there for a moment, unsure how to start. He didn't want to be obvious, didn't want to alarm anyone, but he couldn't stop himself. "I'm Carlos," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. I've been wondering. I don't see anyone around much. Is everything okay here?" The woman eyed him for a long moment, then glanced over her shoulder as if checking for someone. Finally, she stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind her. "Everything's fine," she said, but her voice wavered slightly. "We're just fine inside, that's all." Carlos frowned, sensing the hesitation in her words. "Inside? What do you mean? Why isn't anyone out? The neighborhood's so quiet." The woman's eyes darted to the street, and she lowered her voice. "You don't want to go out too much," she said, her words rushed. "It's safer in here. It's better to stay inside. Inside is safe. Home is safe." Carlos's chest tightened. "Why? What's out there?" The woman took a step back, as if the question itself was too dangerous. She glanced over her shoulder again, and then her eyes softened. "Just stay home. It's better. It's safer. Trust me." Before he could ask more, she stepped back inside and shut the door without a word. Carlos stood there for a moment, his mind racing. Safer. That was the word she'd used. Safer inside. He couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. He turned away and walked to the next house. It was the same thing, over and over. Knock on the door, ask a few questions, and every person he talked to said the same thing. Stay home. It's safer. No one went out. No one left their house. By the time he reached the fifth house, Carlos was beginning to feel that familiar tightness in his chest again, the one that had started the moment he'd stepped outside. The fear. It was becoming impossible to ignore. His mind kept screaming at him to go back, to stop asking questions, to just leave it alone. But he couldn't. Carlos knocked on the door, and it opened to reveal a man in his 40s who looked like he hadn't seen the outside world in days. His face was drawn, his eyes dull, and his posture hunched, as if he had been spending all his time sitting in a chair, staring at something invisible. "What do you want?" the man asked, his voice thick with disinterest. "I'm just asking about the neighborhood," Carlos said quickly. "I've noticed no one's really going outside. Are people just staying home? Is everything okay?" The man stared at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded slowly, his voice low. "Yeah, we're all staying home. You should too. It's safer. Trust me." Carlos's pulse raced. "Why? Why is it safer?" The man hesitated before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. "You just don't know who's out there. Don't go out too much. It's better inside. Stay home. That's all I'm saying. Carlos stepped back, his mind spinning, watching. Safer inside. What the hell was going on? Every single person he talked to felt that same way, too afraid to leave their houses, too willing to accept their isolation. Something wasn't right. He could feel it now, deep in his bones. The fear was everywhere, suffocating the entire neighborhood, and no one was willing to leave. As Carlos turned to head back to the house, the realization hit him with full force. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't some strange quirk of the neighborhood. There was something else at play, something nefarious. Everyone here was afraid, not just of the outside world, but of everything outside their own homes. He quickened his pace, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know what was happening, but he was certain of one thing. He had to get back to the house, to Maria, to Rosita. They were safe inside. Or were they? Carlos sat in his seat at school, absent-mindedly tapping his pencil against the desk as the teacher droned on. It was the middle of the day, the classroom filled with the usual low hum of chatter and shifting papers. But Carlos barely noticed any of it. For the first time in a month, he felt normal. No tightness in his chest, no irrational sense of dread, no overwhelming pull to stay inside, to remain in the house where things felt too controlled. Out here in the school building, it was like a weight had been lifted from him. He glanced around at the other students who were chatting and laughing, oblivious to the strange undercurrent of unease that had been suffocating him. They moved around freely, without a second thought, without hesitation, and Carlos couldn't help but feel a flicker of envy. He wanted to feel that freedom again. But when he thought of the house, of his mother and Rosita, a gnawing sense of discomfort settled back in. The moment he stepped foot in his neighborhood, everything changed. The fear that had haunted him for weeks came back in full force. The outside world felt normal when he was in it. It was his neighborhood. When he was in his neighborhood, the outside world suddenly felt unsafe. Carlos shifted in his seat, pulling his notebook toward him. He needed to get this straight. His thoughts kept circling back to the same conclusion. There was something in his neighborhood, something that made him feel like the world outside was too dangerous, that kept his family stuck in their home. But here at school, that compulsion wasn't there. Why? As the bell rang and students began to pack up their bags, Carlos lingered, his mind racing. He hadn't been able to pinpoint what was causing the fear, but there was one thing he was certain of. It had nothing to do with the world outside. It had everything to do with his neighborhood. That afternoon, Carlos went straight home. The moment he stepped inside the house, the familiar feeling of being watched crept back, settling over him like a thick fog. Rosita was in the living room, sitting on the floor with a puzzle in front of her, her concentration deep as she pieced together the colorful shapes. Maria was humming in the kitchen, the sounds of her routine comfortingly familiar. But Carlos couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. He could feel the sense that he was safe here and nowhere else. But it felt like that fear was inserted in him and not something he actually felt. "Mom," he said, walking into the kitchen, his voice low, "I need to talk to you about something." Maria looked up from the stove, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Hey, sweetie, how was school?" "It was fine," he hesitated, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "But there's something I need to figure out. Something's wrong with the neighborhood." Maria's smile faded slightly as she set the wooden spoon down. "What do you mean?" Carlos looked at her, trying to find the words. "When I'm outside, when I'm at school, I feel normal. But the moment I'm back here, it's like something changes. It's like the neighborhood makes me feel like I have to stay home, like the outside world is too dangerous. I don't get it." Maria's expression shifted, her brow furrowing. "Carlos, you're just adjusting. You've only been here a month." Carlos shook his head. "No, this is different. I talked to some of the neighbors the other day, and they all said the same thing. Stay inside. It's safer here." His voice dropped to a whisper, the weight of the realization hitting him. "They're all afraid to leave. Everyone is." Maria's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "They're just—" "No, Mom," Carlos cut in, frustration creeping into his voice. "It's not just them. It's me too. Every time I even think about leaving, it's like something pulls me back. But when I'm outside the neighborhood, when I'm at school, when I'm anywhere else, it doesn't happen. It's only here. There's something in this neighborhood." Maria took a step back, her face suddenly tight. "Carlos, what are you saying? Are you sure?" Carlos clenched his fists at his sides. "I don't know, but it's not just in my head. I think it's some kind of signal, something in the air, maybe even wireless, something that's making people afraid to leave. The neighbors feel it. I feel it. You feel it." Maria's face went pale, and Carlos could see the flash of fear in her eyes. She took a shaky breath. "Carlos, I don't think—" "Mom," Carlos interrupted, his voice urgent. "I'm serious. We have to get out of here. Something's not right. We have to leave the neighborhood." Maria shook her head. "We're not going anywhere, Carlos. This house is safe. We're safe here. It's safe inside. Safe at home. Safe." Carlos felt the frustration boil over. "It's not safe, Mom. It's like the house is keeping us here, like we're not supposed to leave. You don't feel it, but I do. I can't be the only one who feels like this." Maria's eyes glistened with uncertainty, and Carlos could tell she was fighting the same fear, though she wouldn't admit it. "This house, this place is our home. There's nothing wrong here, Carlos. You're just feeling uneasy, that's all." Carlos stared at her, the tightness in his chest growing. He could see that she was scared too, though she wouldn't let herself admit it. "I need to figure out how to stop this," he muttered under his breath. "If there's something in the air, some kind of signal, we need to find it." Maria took a step toward him, her hand gently resting on his arm. "Carlos, don't do anything rash. This is our home now. We're here for a reason." But Carlos was already thinking ahead. He had to get out, and he had to get his family out, even if it meant finding a way to break the grip of whatever was keeping them inside. There was something controlling them. He felt it deep in his bones, and the only way to fix it was to find out what it was and shut it down. He didn't know how yet, But Carlos had a theory, and if he were right, the answers were somewhere in the air, something invisible, something no one had noticed yet, a signal. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to act before the house and the neighborhood suffocated them all. Carlos spent the next few days in a haze of frustration and unease, unable to shake the feeling that time was slipping away. Every time he tried to focus, his mind kept returning to the same thought. Something was controlling them. The fear, the unease, the feeling that the neighborhood itself was keeping them locked in place. He couldn't shake the sensation that he was being watched, even when no one was around. But the more he thought about it, the more certain he became. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't just isolation or boredom. Something invisible was causing this, and the feeling that the outside wasn't just dangerous, but somehow forbidden. The neighbors felt it, his mom felt it, and he felt it too. But the more he looked for answers, the more it seemed like everyone around him was either denying it or too afraid to confront it. One night after Maria and Rosita had gone to bed, Carlos sat in the living room staring at the walls. His eyes scanned the room, the soft hum of the refrigerator, and the distant sound of the house settling, the only things breaking the silence. His mind raced through the theory he'd been developing. If the fear was in the air, he needed to find a way to prove it. He grabbed his phone and began searching for any information about signals or frequencies in the area. It was a long shot, but he had to try. His gut told him that if he could figure out the source of this invisible fear, he might have a chance of breaking the cycle. Maybe he could get them out. His search didn't turn up much, just vague references to local cell towers and Wi-Fi signals, but nothing concrete. Carlos knew he needed to get closer to the source. He needed to gather more data, find a way to test his theory. The next morning he woke early, before Maria and Rosita, and left the house under the pretense of going for a walk. He told himself it would be quick, just a few minutes outside, but in truth, he wasn't sure if he'd be able to come back at all. The compulsion to stay inside was overwhelming, but he forced himself to push through it, knowing that he had to get answers. The street outside was empty, just as it always was. Carlos walked slowly, his eyes darting back and forth, watching for anything unusual. He had to find the source of this fear. Maybe the cell towers, he thought. Maybe there was something about the signal that was keeping everyone confined. He walked further down the street, past the row of identical houses, until he reached the neighborhood's outskirts, the edge of the housing development, where the paved roads gave way to a patch of overgrown grass. A small, fenced-off area caught his attention, an old satellite dish on a metal stand, tucked behind a cluster of trees. It was out of place, like it didn't belong. Carlos's heart started to race. This was it. This had to be it. He made his way toward the dish, weaving through the trees, and crouched down behind the metal structure. It looked older, like it hadn't been used in years, but something about it felt off. The moment he stepped closer to it, he felt that pull again, the compulsion to go back inside. The fear hit him like a wave, sharp and unrelenting, almost like he was suffocating. He stumbled back, his chest tightening, but he pushed through, fighting the urge to run. Carlos carefully examined the area around the dish. The ground was littered with old cables and wires, many of which were half buried in the dirt. Then his eyes caught something strange. A small box, hidden underneath a pile of leaves and branches, seemed to be attached to the wires running into the dish. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached for it. The box was like something out of a science fiction movie, sleek, black, with blinking lights on its surface. It looked modern, far too high-tech for something that had been left to rust away. Carlos's hands shook as he turned it over. The back of the box had a single label in tiny, almost unreadable print. Signal transmitter, frequency 984.5 gigahertz. This was it. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This box was transmitting something deliberate, a frequency that was affecting everyone in the neighborhood. It explained the fear, the way people couldn't leave their houses, the way they felt trapped. Carlos's mind raced. He knew he had to get this information back to Maria, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just some random signal. This was intentional. Someone, somewhere, was using this technology to keep the residents in line. He could barely contain the rising panic as he carefully picked up the box. The blinking lights flashed faster as his fingers brushed against it. He hesitated for a moment, unsure what to do next, but his fingers itched to break it, to destroy it, and end the fear. But as soon as he tried to force it open, a loud alarm blared to life from within the box. The shrill sound echoed through the trees, sending a jolt of panic straight to his spine. Carlos's heart raced. He dropped the box immediately, but the alarm continued to wail, louder and sharper, the noise unbearable. He grabbed the box again, trying to shut it off, but as his fingers fumbled around, he realized there was no button, no way to stop it. The signal was triggering something he couldn't control. Panic set in as the alarm grew louder, the noise ringing in his ears. His breath quickened, and for a moment he thought he would be overwhelmed by it. The fear was intensifying, hitting him all at once. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Then, with no other choice, Carlos did the only thing he could think to do. He tossed the box as hard as he could, sending it crashing into the underbrush and away from him. The alarm abruptly stopped. For a moment all was silent, save for the ringing in his ears. Carlos stood there, his chest heaving, the adrenaline still coursing through his body. He swallowed hard, trying to calm himself. He knew then that this wasn't over. Someone had put this device here for a reason, and it wasn't just to keep people from leaving. It was meant to control them, and it wasn't just a signal. It was a tool, a way to make them all afraid, to keep them from questioning what was going on. Carlos had to get back to Maria and Rosita. He had to find a way to destroy the signal, to free them. But the thought of going back into the house, back into the grip of the fear, made his heart race again. The closer he got to home, the more the pull would return. But he couldn't turn back now. Carlos's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he moved quickly through the trees, heading back toward his home. His heart still pounded from the adrenaline of the alarm, the sheer weight of the discovery settling heavily in his chest. He couldn't stop thinking about the box, the transmitter, and what it meant. Whoever had placed that device there, whoever had made this signal, was watching them, controlling them, and now Carlos had proof. But as he walked, the gnawing dread started to creep back in, the pressure building in his chest. The closer he got to the street, the more the familiar feeling of compulsion returned. It was like something was tugging at him, dragging him back to the house, back to the safety he'd been so desperate to escape. He shook his head, trying to force his thoughts away from the fear, but then he heard it. Footsteps, too quiet to be anyone from the neighborhood. Carlos froze. His heart skipped a beat. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He scanned the area around him, eyes darting from one side to the other. It was too quiet, too still. His instinct screamed at him to turn around, to run. Before he could react, a heavy hand grabbed his shoulders, spinning him around. Carlos barely had time to react before a cloth was shoved against his face. He tried to gasp, to shout, but the overwhelming smell of chemicals hit him, and everything went black. When Carlos woke, his head was pounding and his vision blurred. His wrists were tied tightly behind him, and he was sitting upright, his back against something cold and hard. He could hear the low hum of machinery around him, the faint sound of people talking in the distance, but it felt like his senses were submerged in water, distant, muffled. It took him a few minutes to orient himself, to figure out where he was. The room he was in was dimly lit, filled with industrial-looking equipment. There were shadows in the corners, people moving, their faces obscured by the dim light. A sharp pain in his head reminded him that the knockout cloth wasn't just a trick. He was still dizzy, disoriented. He tried to move, but his arms were restrained, tied to a chair. Panic set in. Carlos twisted his wrists, trying to loosen the ropes, but it was no use. The knots were tight, the ropes too strong. He strained against his bindings, but nothing gave. Then the door to the room opened and a figure stepped inside. A man in a dark suit, his face sharp and cold. The man's eyes flicked towards Carlos, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition in his gaze. "Welcome back," the man said in a low voice, his words measured and slow. "We were hoping you'd wake up soon." Carlos struggled against the ropes, his heart thundering in his chest. "Where the hell is this?" he spat, his voice hoarse. "Who are you? Why am I here?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, and as he did, Carlos saw more of the room, more of the Black Ops facility hidden deep in the outskirts of the neighborhood. There were computers lined up along one wall, and a strange humming sound that came from somewhere deeper in the building. "Don't worry," the man said, kneeling down in front of Carlos. "You're not in any danger. We just need to have a little chat." Carlos clenched his jaw, trying to hold on to his fear. "What do you want from me?" The man studied him for a moment, then smiled thinly. "We want to understand why you've been so curious, why you've been digging into something you have no business touching." Carlos's eyes widened. He had been found out. They knew. It wasn't just about the signal. It was everything. "You've been poking around in places you shouldn't," the man continued. "And now we're going to make sure you don't cause any more trouble." Carlos felt a chill run through his veins. Who were these people? And how did they know what he'd been investigating? As the man stood up, Carlos tried to make sense of the situation. This place wasn't just a random facility. It was something military, covert, secretive. They had watched him. They knew what he had uncovered. The man turned and nodded at someone behind him. "Take him to the interrogation room," he ordered. Carlos was shoved forward, his chair scraping across the floor, as two other men grabbed his arms. His mind raced. Interrogation room? What was going on? Why had they brought him here? The men didn't answer. They just dragged him down a long, dark hallway, the sound of their boots echoing off the walls. The air grew colder the further they went, and the walls seemed to close in, as if the place itself was swallowing him whole. They stopped in front of a heavy metal door and pushed it open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, and the cold steel of the walls and floor felt oppressive. There was a single chair in the middle of the room, surrounded by bright spotlights. It was like something out of a nightmare. "Sit," the man in the suit said, his tone sharp. Carlos hesitated, but was quickly shoved into the chair. He felt the ropes dig into his wrists as they tied him down. What had he gotten himself into? Was it the signal? Was it the fear that had been keeping everyone trapped in their homes? Had he finally uncovered something he shouldn't have? The man stepped back, and Carlos felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He had to get out. He couldn't let them control him. Not now, not after everything he had uncovered. "Who are you?" Carlos demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "What do you want with me?" The man looked at him with a cold, calculating smile. "You're a problem, you and your little investigation. But don't worry, you'll understand everything soon enough. In time, you'll see exactly why we do what we do." Carlos gritted his teeth, fear creeping up on him. Whatever these people were doing, it was bigger than he had imagined. And now he was trapped. Carlos sat in the cold metal chair, his hands still bound, the rough ropes cutting into his skin. The interrogation room felt smaller than it had moments ago, the stark lights above casting long shadows on the walls. His mind was spinning with everything he had learned, the transmitter, the signal, the way the fear gripped the neighborhood like an invisible hand. But now, in this sterile room, everything felt wrong. The air was thick with a quiet power, as though everything was being controlled, not just in the room, but in his own mind. The man in the dark suit stood across from him, calm and composed, while the woman with the clipboard lingered nearby, watching him with cold, calculating eyes. They had asked him questions before about his investigation, his motivations, but now it seemed the real conversation was about to begin. The man took a seat across from Carlos, folding his hands neatly in front of him. "Carlos, we've spent some time discussing what you've uncovered, but now I'd like to talk to you about why you've been fighting it." Carlos opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. He had been running on adrenaline, but now that he was here, really here, in this place, under their control, the terror was settling in. He could feel the pull of the program, the same pull that kept his neighbors locked in their homes, the same pull that had started to creep into his own thoughts. The man smiled, sensing Carlos's internal struggle. "I know you've been questioning things, Carlos. It's natural. A fully developed brain processes the full signal, but your brain is just developed enough to process part of the signal. We knew that teenagers would cause some difficulties, but we did not foresee the extent to which you are deviating from acceptable parameters. You see things from a perspective that doesn't quite fit the reality we've built." Carlos clenched his jaw, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Built? What do you mean, built? You're just keeping people locked up. You're controlling us." The man's smile didn't falter. "What you're calling control is the very thing that allows us to build a better future, a future without poverty, without crime, without dissent. Carlos's eyes widened. What the hell are you talking about? You're making people afraid to leave their houses. You're trapping them. How is that better? The man's expression grew softer, more patient, as though Carlos were simply a child who hadn't yet learned the lessons of the world. Fear is a natural part of human behavior, Carlos. Fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear of losing control. What we've done here with the program is eliminate those fears. We don't need people living in fear anymore. We've created a world where they can be safe, comfortable, productive. And in return, they've become part of something much larger than themselves. Carlos shook his head, his chest tight. You're lying. You're just keeping people docile, passive. The man leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, as if speaking to a reluctant student. You see, Carlos, that's where you're wrong. People want stability. They need it. The world you want to return to, the one full of chaos, poverty, and violence, it's not sustainable. It's the reason crime exists, the reason there's always dissent, always a need to fight. The fear you've been feeling, that's the key. We've removed it. And in doing so, we've removed the problems of poverty, of unrest, of violence. People at home being productive, not causing trouble or chaos, feel safe and secure. Carlos's mind spun. You think fear is the problem? It's not the fear. It's what you're doing to people. You're taking their will. You're taking their lives. The man raised an eyebrow. You misunderstand. People no longer need to fight for their place in society. They no longer need to worry about survival. We've made the world safer by removing the unpredictability. The program ensures that people can live without the constant stress of daily existence. The anxiety, the panic, it's been erased. People can now be productive, their minds focused on contributing to society, not on surviving. Carlos's head was spinning. He felt a wave of nausea flood over him. The man was speaking as if all of this was normal, as if this was how the world should be. You don't understand, Carlos. People have always lived with this fear. The reason there's always been crime, always been poverty, is because people are left to their own devices. They're given too much freedom, too much choice. The world you want to return to, it doesn't work. It never has. The woman with the clipboard stepped forward now, her voice clinical and detached. We've implemented the program in several neighborhoods, and it's been incredibly successful. Crime rates have dropped to 0. Social unrest is all but non-existent. People are happier, more focused, and more productive. It's the future, Carlos. We've removed all the barriers to success, all the things that made life difficult. Carlos's stomach twisted. He tried to fight the compulsion, the pull to accept what they were saying, to believe that maybe this was a better way. But deep down he knew it was wrong. This was not freedom. This was submission. No, Carlos said firmly. This isn't freedom. This is control. This is everything I've been fighting against. The man's eyes softened, a pitying look crossing his face. You'll understand in time. Everyone does. You'll see that this is for the greater good. This is the future, and you're part of it. We'll help you see that, Carlos." Carlos didn't say anything. His chest felt tight, his breath shallow. He was trapped between the terrifying reality of what was happening and the realization that they would stop at nothing to keep him in line. They had already started on his mother, on Rosita. They were already indoctrinating them, and they were willing to do the same to him. The man leaned back, his expression turning calculating once more. "We're offering you a future without the burdens of the old world, a world without poverty, without crime, without dissent, a world where you can be content." Carlos looked up, meeting the man's gaze. The room felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on him. But he wouldn't let them take him. He wouldn't let them take his mind, his will, his freedom. "No," Carlos repeated, his voice firm. "I'll never accept it." The man's expression hardened, but he said nothing. He simply nodded to the woman, who stepped forward and began untying Carlos's ropes. "You'll understand eventually, Carlos," she said as the man stood and turned towards the door. "You all will." Carlos had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same thing. The walls of the cold, sterile room pressing in on him, the man in the suit's calculating eyes, and the woman's cool clinical voice offering a twisted version of reality. He could still feel the weight of their words on his chest, the unsettling way they tried to indoctrinate him, to make him believe that the world they were creating was the only way to live. The programming, the control, the idea that they were offering stability at the cost of everything that made him him. It wasn't freedom, it was a cage. But Carlos wasn't stupid. He knew this wasn't over. They weren't going to let him go that easily. They had plans for him, for his family, and as much as he fought it, he couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his gut that things were going to get much worse before they got better. The door to his room opened with a quiet click, and Carlos snapped his head up. 2 armed guards stepped inside, their presence imposing. But it wasn't the guards that caught his attention. It was the figures standing behind them. Maria, Rosita. His heart lurched as he saw them. They were both in handcuffs, Maria's face pale, Rosita clutching her mother's hand like a lifeline, her eyes wide with confusion. Neither of them said anything as they were led into the room, and for a long moment, Carlos simply stared at them, trying to process what was happening. The man in the suit was standing by the door now, watching him with that same detached expression. "Carlos, it's time to make a decision," he said, his voice smooth, as if this was all just another formality. Maria's eyes locked onto Carlos, and the fear in her gaze was unmistakable. She wasn't just afraid for herself. She was afraid for him. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew it was bad. She could feel it. "Carlos, what's going on?" Maria asked, her voice shaking, but she quickly tried to steady herself. "What's happening? What are they doing to us?" Carlos clenched his fists, trying to hold back the panic that threatened to choke him. He wanted to protect them, to take them away from this nightmare, but he knew it wasn't that simple. They were trapped, and so was he. The man in the suit glanced at the woman, who stepped forward and smiled at Carlos, as if they were having a casual conversation. "Carlos, we've offered you the opportunity to understand our system. You've rejected it, but we've decided to give you one final offer." Carlos felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He glanced at his mother and sister, their expressions now full of fear. His gaze flickered back to the man. "What kind of offer?" Carlos demanded, his voice low but firm. The man nodded to the guards, who stepped aside, leaving the woman to walk toward Carlos with a folder in her hands. She opened it and placed it on the table in front of him. "A financial settlement," she said, her voice almost too polite, too smooth, "in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement." Carlos's brow furrowed. "A non-disclosure agreement? What does that even mean? What are you trying to say?" The man stepped forward, his tone almost patronizing. "It's simple. We're offering you a life outside of the programming. You and your family will be allowed to leave the neighborhood. You'll receive a substantial settlement, a reward for your cooperation. In exchange, you all sign the agreement and you agree to keep all of this confidential. It's a one-time offer." Carlos stared at him, his blood running cold. "You're trying to buy us off? To silence us?" The woman's smile didn't waver. "It's not about buying you, Carlos. It's about offering you a future. We've done what we needed to do to ensure that people live without fear, without crime, without the uncertainty of the outside world. We're offering you freedom. You'll be financially stable, you'll be safe, and you can live without the constant pressure of wondering what's next. You'll be set for life." Maria's voice cracked as she spoke, her eyes still wide with confusion and fear. "Carlos, don't. We don't know what they're offering. We don't understand any of this." The man ignored her, focusing entirely on Carlos. "We know you're scared, Carlos. We know you feel conflicted. But it's the best option you'll ever have. You're too young to understand fully, but you'll see it in time. And once you do, you'll realize how much better this life is. It's a privilege." Carlos felt his stomach churn, but as he looked at his family, Maria, her face pale and tight with stress, Rosita, her small frame trembling beside her, he knew that the fear he had seen in their eyes was real. They weren't strong enough to fight this. His mind raced with thoughts of how they had no choice, how everything in the world had already been decided for them. This wasn't freedom, it wasn't choice. They were cornered. "I won't sign it," Carlos said, the words escaping his mouth before he could even think them. His heart pounded in his chest as the room seemed to get smaller, more suffocating. The man's expression darkened slightly. He exchanged a glance with the woman, who stepped forward again. "Carlos, we need to make one thing clear," she said, her tone no longer polite, but cold and firm. "If you refuse to sign, or if you breach the agreement in any way, we will have no choice but to ensure your family's compliance in other ways." Carlos's blood ran cold. What did that mean? He couldn't help but shiver at the implication. He had no choice now. The fear, the overwhelming pressure that had been mounting inside him, pressed harder, like a vice around his chest. "We will allow you to leave the neighborhood," the man continued, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "But you will live with the consequences. You'll be free, but you'll never feel safe." The woman's voice was flat now, cold. "You and your family will be taken care of, provided for, but you will never speak of what you've seen. You will never speak of what we've done. You will remain silent for the good of everyone." Carlos swallowed, his hands shaking. His mind screamed for him to stand firm, to fight back. But his family, His mother and sister were at stake. He looked at Maria, at Rosita. They were terrified, and he could see it in their eyes. He focused on his mom. She nodded and said, "Sign it." What else could he do? What choice did they have? The man waited, watching him. Carlos took a deep breath and slowly reached for the pen. He had no other choice. The hotel room was quiet, too quiet. Maria sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap as she stared at the empty walls. The sterile white space felt foreign, even more so than the house they had just left behind. There were no familiar pictures, no little corners where Rosita's toys had been scattered, or where they had all sat together at the kitchen table. No sign of life, just the cold, unfeeling walls of the temporary place they were staying until they figured out what came next. Rosita was in the bathroom, humming to herself as she brushed her teeth, blissfully unaware of the weight pressing down on her mother. She was happy, genuinely happy. For her, the world was as it should be. She had everything she needed: safety, stability, and comfort. Maria's heart twisted as she thought about it. She had made this choice for Rosita, for Carlos, and yet the guilt gnawed inside her like a slow poison. Was it the right choice? Was taking the settlement, accepting the non-disclosure agreement, the right path for them? The door clicked open behind her, and Maria turned to find Carlos standing in the doorway, his gaze distant, his posture stiff. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, but there was a certain weight to it, like he, too, was trying to make sense of the days that had passed. Maria gave him a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she said, forcing the words out. I just need a moment to adjust, that's all." Carlos didn't answer immediately. He crossed the room slowly, the silence between them stretching thin. He sat down on the other bed and looked out the window, his eyes following the distant skyline. Maria watched him closely. He looked different. The fire that had been there before, the rebellious streak, the defiance, was gone. In its place was something deeper, something harder. "I don't think I'm ever going to get used to this," Carlos finally said, his voice flat. Maria's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "This life, this settled life, it feels like we're just waiting for something." Maria shook her head, trying to force the words out. "We're out now, Carlos. I can't believe I didn't realize something was really wrong. I'm sorry you had to protect us instead of me." Carlos cut her off with a quiet laugh, but there was no joy in it. "You were literally brainwashed, Mom, just like everyone else in the neighborhood that we abandoned." Maria froze. "Carlos," he stood abruptly, his hands running through his hair. "I know. We had to save ourselves. I still feel guilty, though." Maria's stomach sank as she watched her son struggle. He had always been the one who was strong, the one who could stand up for himself. But now, in this strange, unfamiliar world they had created, she could see the cracks beginning to form in him. The unease was just as strong in him as it was in her. "I know it's hard," Maria said softly, standing up and walking over to him. "But this is the best thing we could have done. We've got a chance to start over. You know that, right?" Carlos didn't respond at first. His eyes flickered to her, then to the window. Finally, he nodded, but the expression on his face was more like resignation than relief. Yeah, I guess. The door opened again and Rosita bounced in, her face bright with that innocent joy she always carried. Mom, Carlos, look what I found. She held up a small stuffed animal she'd found in the hotel's gift shop, a fluffy bunny with oversized ears and a wide, toothy smile. Can we keep him? Maria's heart softened as Rosita held up the stuffed animal, her little eyes wide with excitement. The weight of what they had done was still there, but in this moment, her daughter was simply a child. She wasn't thinking about the bigger picture, the consequence of their choices. Maria knelt down and pulled Rosita into a hug. Of course we can, sweetheart. He's perfect. Carlos watched them for a moment, then walked over to the window again, looking out at the city lights. The quiet hum of the hotel's air conditioning filled the room, the only sound besides the soft rustle of Rosita's new stuffed bunny in her arms. I don't know how to feel, Carlos finally said, his voice quieter now. I don't know if this was the right choice, but I know I couldn't live with the alternative. I couldn't risk you or Rosita. Maria's heart hurt at his words. She wanted to tell him that it was all going to be okay, that they would figure this out. But even as she said it to herself, she knew it wasn't true. They had made a deal. They had signed their lives away for a future free of control. But what did that really mean? They had to find a way to live in a world where the neighborhood also existed. The next few weeks passed in a haze of paperwork and adjusting to their new life. Their belongings had been shipped to them from the neighborhood, their things packed up, ready to be settled in a new space. The financial settlement gave them enough to get by, to find a new place to live, and for a moment, things felt like they could be okay. Maria started looking at houses, thinking about where they might go next. But the guilt never left. Every time she looked at Rosita playing with her stuffed bunny, laughing as she ran around the hotel room, Maria couldn't escape the nagging thought, what have we sacrificed? And every time she looked at Carlos, his eyes a little darker, his spirit a little quieter, she wondered if they had traded too much. The fear that held them in the neighborhood was gone, replaced with something else, something even more dangerous, the fear of freedom. They had chosen safety, but at what cost? Months had passed since they left the hotel, and the unsettling weight of their past life seemed to fade little by little. Carlos still carried the memory of what they'd gone through, but as time wore on, it became easier to breathe. They had a new home now, a house on the edge of the city, a place that didn't come with walls closing in on them. It was modest, but it felt like their own, and that in itself made it feel like a victory. Maria had found a job as a customer service representative for a tech company that allowed her to work from home. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and more importantly, it kept the pressure off. She wasn't overwhelmed by the suffocating fear of not having enough, of falling behind. She could breathe, and as the days passed, her confidence returned. She smiled more, laughed more, becoming more like the woman Carlos remembered before they had fallen into the trap of the neighborhood. Rosita, the bright spot in their lives, had fully embraced the new routine. She was the same energetic little girl, always running from room to room, talking to her imaginary friends and laughing as she spent her afternoon drawing pictures of animals and flowers. One of her favorite things was when Maria would take her to the nearby park. It was a small park with an old swing set and a tired-looking slide. But to Rosita, it was the best place in the world. It was the place where she could run free, her laughter echoing in the open air. Maria was happy. Rosita was happy. And Carlos was beginning to find peace in their new normal, though his mind was forever changed by the events of the past year. He had matured in ways that didn't quite sit right with him. Sometimes when he looked in the mirror, he saw someone older, someone who had seen too much too soon. But he'd made peace with it. It was different now. The weight of their old life, the fear, the manipulation, had been replaced with the normal struggles of everyday life. And for Carlos, that was enough. One afternoon, as he climbed aboard the bus to head home from school, he glanced out the window. The streets were lined with row after row of houses, some new and some old. But there was something else that caught his attention. A large, undeveloped field set off to the side of the road, fenced off with a sign in bright, bold letters, posted directly in the center of the open space. He squinted at the sign, his brow furrowing. It was new. He hadn't seen it before. As the bus slowly drove past, the words jumped out at him. Coming soon, a new affordability neighborhood, a home with all bills paid included, and a career to afford it. All your family needs. Carlos felt his stomach twist as his eyes lingered on the sign. The words felt familiar, like they had been written for him, the same phrases that had been used to pull him into that neighborhood before. Affordable housing, security, and the vague promises of a better life. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and for a moment everything in him froze. He could feel the unease rising in his chest again, like it was pulling him back into that familiar grip. He had escaped that life, hadn't he? They were free now, weren't they? But the more he stared at the sign, the more he realized it wasn't just a coincidence. The same promises were being sold. The same traps were being set. The phrase, all your family needs, felt like a baited hook, ready to reel in the vulnerable, the desperate. The bus continued on its route, but Carlos couldn't look away from the sign. The world around him seemed to blur, the sound of the engine fading into the background. Were they really free? Or was the same programming lurking just beyond the surface, waiting to pull them back? His heart pounded in his chest as he looked down at the small, quiet neighborhood that had once been a prison. They'd escaped, but now, seeing the sign, the realization hit him. They could be trapped again. He didn't know how or when it would happen. He didn't know if it would be that exact neighborhood or something else, but he knew what he had to do. This was never over. They had to stay vigilant. They had to make sure they never fell into the same cycle again. As the bus turned onto their street and the sign faded from view, Carlos leaned back against the window, feeling a mixture of fear and determination settle in his chest. He'd promised himself he wouldn't let his family fall prey to the same manipulation again, not if he could help it. But for now, he would go home. He would keep his family safe. They were free, but freedom was fragile, and Carlos had learned that the hard way. The room was quiet, save for the soft tapping of pens against notepads and the hum of a projector running at the front. The walls were stark white, with charts and graphs neatly arranged across the screen, showing data in neat calculated rows. The faces around the conference table were a mix of sharp suits and focused expressions, people who had been in the business of social engineering long enough to understand what made a program work. Today, they were here to review the results of a new initiative, a series of housing developments that had, on paper, been a resounding success. The head of the meeting, a middle-aged man with graying hair and rimless glasses, cleared his throat as he addressed the group. His voice was steady, calm, confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to begin by discussing the metrics we've gathered from our latest housing developments. These projects, these programs, are more than just homes. They're a long-term investment in stability." He clicked a button and the screen behind him switched to the first slide, listing the main success parameters of the project: decreased public assistance, decreased crime, decreased civil unrest, and decreased birth rates. "We've seen a substantial reduction in public assistance claims within the neighborhoods we've integrated the program into," the man continued, tapping the slide with his pen. "A 70% decrease in just the last 6 months. This is a direct result of our implementation of controlled employment within these communities, work-from-home positions, government-supported, that feed both the individual and the system." A woman to his right nodded, jotting down some notes. "The reduction in public assistance is significant. What about crime rates?" The man smiled. "Crime, of course, follows the same pattern. A 60% drop in reported crimes within the targeted areas. When people have economic stability and are part of a system that keeps them content and focused, the desire to rebel, to disrupt, diminishes. No more petty theft, no more violence fueled by desperation. Most of the reports are domestic disturbances." Another person seated across the table raised an eyebrow. "And civic unrest? The protests and the demonstrations we used to see in these regions?" "Down 80% from the data we've compiled," the man replied confidently. "In fact, some of the last protest groups have been disbanded entirely. There's no need for unrest when everyone's basic needs are met without the burden of conflict. As you can see, these results speak for themselves." The room nodded collectively, taking in the figures, the percentages, the neatness of the success. "But the most striking statistic," the man said, flicking to the next slide, "is the birth rate. As we've seen, the decrease in births is also an important part of the success we're monitoring. The shift in reproductive trends is evident in the regions we've tested." The woman who had spoken earlier tilted her head. "A decrease in birth rates? Is that a positive outcome for us?" "Absolutely," the man responded, his voice steady. "It's a reflection of what we've designed, a controlled population that ensures long-term stability. Fewer children in households means fewer mouths to feed, fewer dependents on the system. This isn't just about controlled birth rates. This is about the quality of life. When people are focused on their work, when they don't feel the need to expand their families beyond their means, they're more productive, more compliant, more content. And remember," he continued, "the lower birth rates are targeted to the lower income population that reside in our developments. The people who can't afford childcare are having less children. The middle and upper classes should gradually increase their birth rates as the tax burden from supporting low-income households decreases. The woman nodded slowly, as if weighing the implications of the statement. So to summarize, we have lower crime, lower public assistance, less unrest, and a reduction in the population growth targeted towards the lower class. All indicators point to long-term stability. Exactly, the man said, clicking the remote to move to the final slide, which simply said, Program Success. We have successfully created manageable communities. People are contributing to society without challenging the system, and they're more content in their place. Another man at the table, younger and more skeptical, spoke up. But do we ever consider what happens to the individuals within these communities? The ones who resist? The ones who fight the system like that boy Carlos? The room fell silent for a moment. The man at the head of the table shifted slightly, his hands steepled in front of him. Resistors, yes. The ones who fight the system. They are an anomaly. But what's important is that they can be reprogrammed. The system isn't infallible, of course. Some individuals are more resistant to our methods, but that's where we come in. With enough time, with the right approach, they'll eventually see that this is for the greater good. And if they don't, well, they've been compensated for their troubles. We've given them a way out. The younger man didn't seem satisfied with the answer, but he said nothing more. Instead, he jotted something down in his notebook, his expression tight. The others exchanged a few more approving glances. The real key, the head of the meeting continued, is that we've created an environment where compliance is natural. People don't have to be forced to adhere to the system. They believe it's the only option available to them. They're happy because they don't question. And what about the ones who can't accept it? The ones who break through? The younger man pressed again. The head of the meeting smiled. As I said, they have choices. We provide them with the means to accept the program, or they accept the consequences of rejecting it. Either way, it's all part of the balance. Outside the window, the city skyline stretched in all its modernity. The buildings stood tall, gleaming in the sunlight, as the symbols of progress, of a society that had learned to control the chaos, to manage the uncontrollable. Everything was in its place according to plan. Stability, order, control. And for the residents of these carefully curated neighborhoods, the world was exactly as it was designed.